The elves never screamed when they died. That's what disturbed me most during my first week in the Whispering Vale. I'd seen death before, plenty of it, the kind that comes quick in border skirmishes or slow in field hospitals. But this was different. When the forest took them, they simply stopped. One moment a scout would be checking the tree line, the next, he'd be gone. No cry for help, no struggle, just absence. I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Garrett Thane, formerly a cartographer for the Imperial Survey Corps. I was sent to map the eastern boundaries of what the locals called the Everwood, a massive expanse of old-growth forest that had somehow avoided every logging operation, every settlement expansion, every military campaign that had swept through the region over the past 3 centuries. The elves who lived there had a treaty with the Empire. We left them alone. They left us alone. Simple enough. Except the treaty was breaking down. Elven refugees had started appearing at border towns, which was unprecedented. Elves didn't leave the Everwood. They'd lived there for over 2,000 years, long before humans had even reached this continent. Yet here they were, hollow-eyed and silent, refusing to speak about what had driven them out. The Empire needed to know what was happening. Hence, my assignment. The expedition consisted of 12 people, 3 soldiers led by Captain Veronica Chen, a woman whose service record included campaigns I wasn't cleared to know about, 4 scholars from the University of Valen, specialists in elven culture and forest ecology, 2 healers, a tracker named Kyle who'd worked the borderlands his entire life, a cook, and me. We entered the Everwood on the first day of autumn. The trees there don't follow normal patterns. Oak, ash and pine grow intertwined, their roots forming bridges across streams that run too clear, too cold. The canopy blocks most sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight even at noon. Everything smells of moss and something else, something sweet and rotten at the same time, like fruit left too long on the vine. The elven settlement we were heading toward was called Silverthane, supposedly one of their largest communities. 3 days' travel from the border. We had maps, of course, drawn by elven hands decades ago as part of the treaty negotiations, but Kyle kept muttering that the paths didn't match what he remembered from his youth, back when he'd occasionally traded with forest elves near the border. On the second day, we found the first body, an elk, massive and ancient, its antlers spanning at least 6 feet. It lay in a clearing, perfectly preserved despite being dead for what must have been weeks. No scavengers had touched it. No insects crawled across its hide. The scholars examined it with growing unease, noting that its eyes were still open, still somehow wet, staring at something none of us could see. "The forest is rejecting death," said Dr. Marin, the eldest of the academics. She ran her hand just above the elk's flank without touching it. "Preservation without purpose. This isn't natural decay being prevented. This is decay being forbidden." I didn't understand the distinction then. I would later. We camped that night in a grove of silver birch. Captain Chen posted double watches. I remember lying in my tent, listening to sounds that almost resembled bird calls, but weren't quite right. The rhythm was too regular, too purposeful, like language, stripped of meaning. Morning brought our first contact with the elves. 3 of them appeared at the edge of our camp as we were breaking down tents. They wore traditional forest garb, leather and woven bark, but their faces held an expression I'd never seen on any elf before. Fear, raw and undisguised. They spoke in their own language, rapid and melodic. One of our scholars, Dr. Thess, translated haltingly. The elves were warning us to turn back. They used a phrase that Thess couldn't quite render in our tongue, something about the forest remembering itself. When Captain Chen pressed them about Silverthane, about what had happened to drive elves from their ancestral home, the 3 went silent. Then they simply walked back into the trees, moving with that characteristic elven grace that made them seem like they were part of the forest itself. "We continue," Chen announced, "but weapons stay ready." The paths grew stranger. Trees that should have been separate had somehow merged, their trunks flowing together like melted wax. We found clearings that were too perfectly circular, their edges marked by mushrooms growing in patterns that hurt to look at too long. The streams ran uphill in places, not obviously, but enough that our compasses started giving contradictory readings. On the fourth day, we lost our first person. Dr. Hendren, a mycologist who'd been examining the unusual fungal growths we kept encountering. One moment he was crouched beside a fallen log 20 feet from the main group. The next, he wasn't. We searched for 6 hours. Found nothing except his journal, lying open to a page covered in sketches of spore patterns that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. The cook wanted to turn back. Captain Chen refused. We were less than a day from Silverthane now, according to the maps. We'd come too far to retreat without answers. That night, I volunteered for the final watch. 3 hours before dawn, the darkest part of night. I sat with my back against a tree that was probably older than my entire civilization, listening to the forest breathe. Because it did breathe. Once you spent enough time there, you could feel it, a slow rhythm that had nothing to do with wind. That's when I saw them. Shapes moving between the trees, dozens of them. At first I thought they were elves, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, moving in ways that suggested joints bending in directions joints shouldn't bend. I didn't raise the alarm. Something told me that would be worse. Instead, I sat perfectly still and watched them pass through our camp, weaving between sleeping forms, pausing occasionally to observe us with tilted heads and eyes that reflected our campfire light like an animal's would. They didn't touch anyone. They just looked. Then they continued on, disappearing into the darkness beyond our small circle of firelight. When my watch ended and I woke Captain Chen, I told her what I'd seen. She believed me immediately. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it terrified me more than the creatures themselves had. The elves, she said quietly, staring into the dying fire, have been warning us about the deep forest for 300 years. We never listened because nothing ever came out. We thought that meant we were safe. She looked at me then, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never expected to see from a decorated military officer. We were wrong. The forest wasn't keeping something in. It was keeping something away from us. I didn't sleep after that. None of us really did. We lay in our bedrolls pretending, but I could see eyes glinting in the darkness, hear the subtle shifts of people checking weapons they'd positioned within easy reach. Dawn came differently in the deep forest. No gradual lightening of the sky, no birdsong crescendo. One moment it was night, the next pale grey light filtered through the canopy, revealing a world that looked subtly wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The trees surrounding our camp had changed positions, not dramatically. Just enough that the gap we'd entered through now faced a different direction. The fallen log Dr. Hendren had been examining was gone entirely, leaving only undisturbed moss where it should have been. Captain Chen noticed immediately. She didn't comment, just began breaking down her tent with mechanical precision while the rest of us pretended not to notice that the forest had rearranged itself around us overnight. We reached Silverthane 2 hours later. The maps hadn't prepared us. They showed a city marked with the standard symbols for elven architecture. Towers and platforms built into living trees, the kind of settlement that worked with nature rather than against it. Beautiful, harmonious, safe. What we found was a wound. The trees stood in a perfect circle, their trunks twisted into shapes that suggested screaming. In the centre, where the city should have been, was nothing. Not ruins, not overgrowth reclaiming abandoned structures, just empty space that felt fuller than it should. The air pressure was wrong there. Walking toward the centre of that circle felt like pushing through water, like reality had congealed into something thicker, more resistant. Lieutenant Marcos threw a stone into the emptiness. We watched it fall normally for about 3 feet, then it stopped, hung suspended in midair for 5 heartbeats, dropped again. Stopped again. Eventually it reached the ground, but it took 40 seconds to fall 15 feet. Time distortion, whispered Chen. But that wasn't quite right. Time was moving normally for us. It was space that had gotten strange, stretched and compressed in ways that made my surveyor's training completely useless. The cook was crying silently, tears running down his weathered face. He'd been the most skeptical member of our expedition. Now he was the first to truly understand what we'd found. This wasn't a mystery to be solved, It was a scar, evidence of something that had happened here, something so fundamentally wrong that reality itself still bore the marks. I started sketching because that's what surveyors do when confronted with the incomprehensible. Document, measure, map. My hands moved automatically while my mind tried to process what my eyes were seeing. The twisted trees form patterns, deliberate ones. I'd studied enough elven architecture to recognize intentionality when I saw it. These trees had been shaped, guided into these configurations over decades or centuries of careful cultivation. But they'd been shaped into a cage. The realization hit me like cold water. Every tree positioned precisely, every branch angled to reinforce the containment. The elves hadn't built Silverthane here. They'd built it around something, trying to seal it away. Captain. My voice sounded strange in that place, too flat, like the air was absorbing the sound. This was a prison. She was already nodding. She'd reached the same conclusion examining the tree patterns from a different angle. What kind of threat required an entire city to contain it? What could be so dangerous that the elves, who'd survived the Cataclysm Wars and the Age of Shadows, had abandoned one of their greatest settlements rather than continue living here? Private Westbrook started screaming. Not the scream of someone injured or frightened, something worse. The scream of someone whose mind had touched something it wasn't equipped to process. He was staring at the empty space in the center of the circle, pointing with a trembling hand at nothing I could see. The other soldiers grabbed him, tried to turn him away, but his eyes stayed locked on that absence. "It's looking back," he whispered when the screaming stopped. "It sees us. It's been waiting so long, and it sees us, and it's so hungry, and it remembers when the stars were young, and—" Captain Chen slapped him. Hard. The sharp crack of it seemed to break whatever connection he'd made. He collapsed, sobbing, while the medic checked his pupils and pulse with shaking hands. "We're leaving," Chen announced. "Now, we document what we found, and we leave." But the forest had other ideas. The path we'd followed here was gone. Not hidden or overgrown, simply absent, as if it had never existed. The trees stood shoulder to shoulder in every direction, their trunks forming an impenetrable wall, except in one direction, toward the center of the circle, toward the emptiness that had broken Westbrook's mind. "Tools!" barked Chen. "We cut our way out." The first axe strike against the nearest tree produced no sound. The blade bit into wood, but silently, as if we were watching through thick glass. The second strike went deeper, but still made no noise. The third strike went through the trunk entirely, the axe passing through solid wood like it was smoke. The tree stood unchanged, unbothered. The axe blade came away clean, not even a mark on its edge. Lieutenant Marcos tried his service knife on a different tree. Same result. The blade passed through without resistance, without effect. The forest wasn't blocking our path through physical means. It simply refused to acknowledge our attempts to change it. I looked at my sketches. The patterns in the twisted trees, the careful positioning that formed a containment structure. "It's not keeping us in," I said quietly. "It's keeping something from following us out." Captain Chen's face went pale. She understood immediately. Whatever the elves had imprisoned here, whatever had driven them from Silverthane, the forest was still maintaining the seal, and we were on the wrong side of it. The only path available led inward, toward the centre, toward the thing that had looked back at Westbrook. "We don't have a choice," Chen said, though everything in her military training was screaming that there had to be another option. "We go forward, or we die here." She looked at each of us in turn, giving everyone a chance to object, to suggest an alternative. Nobody spoke. What was there to say? We began walking toward the centre of Silverthane, toward the emptiness that wasn't empty, while the twisted trees watched our approach with the patient interest of wardens observing condemned prisoners walking to their cells. The trees changed as we walked, not gradually, but in distinct rings, like we were descending through layers of reality itself. The first ring had been twisted trunks. The second ring, which we entered now, featured trees that had stopped pretending to follow natural laws entirely. Their branches grew downward into the soil. Their roots reached toward the sky, grasping at air like drowning hands. Leaves grew from bark in geometric patterns that hurt to perceive directly. I tried sketching one, and my hand refused to complete the lines. The pencil would reach a certain point and simply stop, as if it had encountered an invisible wall. Dr. Vance was muttering calculations under her breath, numbers that made no sense. "Negative growth rings," she whispered. "The trees are younger at their core than at their bark. They're growing backwards through time." I wanted to tell her that was impossible, but impossible had stopped meaning anything the moment we entered Silverthane. Private Chen had her rifle up, sweeping the spaces between trees, looking for threats she could shoot. I almost pitied her. What good was a bullet against geometry that refused to obey Euclidean principles? The emptiness at the centre was closer now. I could feel it pulling at my attention. Not like gravity, more like the way your tongue finds a missing tooth, an absence that demanded acknowledgement. Westbrook had recovered enough to walk, but his eyes stayed unfocused. He was reciting something. Old Elvish, I realised. The few words I caught translated roughly to, "Forgive us, we didn't know, forgive us," over and over. "How does he know Elvish?" Lieutenant Marcos asked quietly. Nobody answered. We all knew he hadn't known it an hour ago. The third ring of trees looked almost normal at first glance. Straight trunks, proper branches, leaves in reasonable places. Then you noticed the details. Every tree was identical. Not similar, identical. Same number of branches, same arrangement of leaves, same subtle imperfection in the bark at exactly chest height. "Copies," Dr. Vance breathed, like someone saved a single tree file and pasted it 1,000 times. But that wasn't quite right either. As we passed between them, I realized they weren't copies. They were the same tree, somehow existing in multiple locations simultaneously. When wind rustled the leaves of one, they all moved in perfect synchronization because they were all the same leaves. The implications made my head ache. Captain Chen called a halt at the edge of the fourth ring. We'd been walking for 20 minutes, but the centre didn't seem any closer. Distance had become negotiable in Silverthane. "Rations and water," she ordered. 5 minutes. We ate in silence. The corpse starch rations tasted like cardboard, but the familiar military blandness was oddly comforting. Something normal in a place where normal had been revoked. I was finishing my water when I noticed the fourth ring's trees. They were watching us. Not metaphorically. The bark had developed structures that resembled eyes, dozens of them covering each trunk, all focused on our small group. As we moved, the eyes tracked us, pupils made of darker wood following our movements with unmistakable intent. "We're being observed," I said, voice steady despite the ice forming in my gut. "By trees?" Marco sounded like he desperately wanted to laugh. Like if he could laugh, this would become absurd instead of terrifying. "By whatever made the trees this way," Captain Chen corrected. "Keep moving." The fourth ring was mercifully short. Beyond it, we found what had to be the fifth and final ring. These trees were dead. Completely, utterly dead. Grey wood, no leaves, no bark. But they stood in a perfect circle, their branches interwoven to form a dome overhead, a cathedral made of corpses. And in the centre of that cathedral, we found what the elves had imprisoned. It wasn't a creature, wasn't a demon or monster or any physical thing. It was a concept given form, an idea that had gained enough weight to dent reality around it. The best way I can describe it is this. Imagine forgetting the word for something you see every day. Not just the word, but the understanding of what it is. That confusion, that moment of profound wrongness when your brain insists you should know something but can't access it. That feeling had become solid, had become present, had become aware. It existed in the space where meaning went to die. Looking at it directly was impossible. My eyes would slide away, seeking anything else to focus on. But I could perceive it in peripheral vision, a shape that was simultaneously too large and too small. a presence that was both infinitely distant and pressed against my skin. It noticed us noticing it. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in an instant. Frost formed on the dead trees, spreading in patterns that spelled words in languages that had never been spoken aloud. My breath came out in white clouds that hung in the air too long, forming shapes that almost meant something before dissipating. Westbrook started screaming again, different words this time. Still elvish. I caught fragments. Bound in ignorance, sealed in forgetting, imprisoned in the spaces between thought. "Well, what is it?" Captain Chen demanded, though her voice had lost its military certainty. Dr. Vance was crying, tears freezing on her cheeks. "It's the reason Silverthane was abandoned. The elves didn't leave. They were erased. This thing, whatever it is, it consumes meaning, identity. It ate the concept of who they were, and the forest grew to contain what remained." The presence shifted. Not moving physically, but adjusting its attention, focusing on us with interest that felt like razor blades against exposed nerves. My sketches began changing. Lines I'd drawn an hour ago were rearranging themselves on the page, forming new patterns, new geometries. The trees I'd documented were rewriting themselves in my notebook, becoming something else, becoming instructions. Instructions for how to break the seal. "It wants out," I whispered. "It's been waiting here for 1,000 years, and it wants out, and it's showing me how to free it." The knowledge was forcing itself into my mind, how the dead trees formed a cage, how the twisted trees maintained the binding, how the geometric patterns had to be disrupted in a specific sequence to collapse the containment. I didn't want to know these things, but the information carved itself into my brain anyway, permanent as scars. "We have to leave," Captain Chen said. "Now! We forget we ever found this place." But could we? Could anyone forget something that existed specifically to be unforgettable? Something that had spent a millennium learning how to survive in the spaces between thoughts? The forest began to move around us, dead branches creaking with impossible life, and I realized we'd never actually had a choice about any of this. We'd been brought here for a reason. The trees formed a corridor, not by moving, but by our perception shifting until we understood they'd always been arranged this way, leading deeper into the heart of the containment pattern. We followed because the alternative was standing still while reality bent around us. Westbrook had gone silent, his lips still moving but no sound emerging. The elvish words had burned themselves out, leaving only muscle memory. Dr. Vance kept her eyes fixed on her instruments, even though the readings had stopped making sense 300 meters back. Her altimeter claimed we were simultaneously at sea level and 17,000 feet above it. Captain Chen tried her radio again. Static answered, but it had rhythm now. Pattern, almost like speech in a frequency human throats couldn't produce. My hands moved without permission, sketching, the notebook pages filled with diagrams I didn't consciously draw. Geometric proofs, ritual instructions, a map of something that existed in more dimensions than I could perceive but somehow understood anyway. The presence followed us, or we followed it. The distinction had stopped mattering. We emerged into a clearing that shouldn't exist. The dead trees formed a perfect circle, their branches interlocked overhead in a dome of twisted wood. At the centre stood a stone platform covered in elvish script that hurt to read. The words kept changing, trying different languages, searching for one that would stick in our minds. On the platform sat a single object, a book, bound in leather that had never come from any animal. Its pages were visible through the open cover, filled with text that rewrote itself continuously, trying out different stories, different histories, searching for the narrative that would make itself real. "That's the anchor," Dr. Vance whispered. "The elves bound it in there, trapped it in a story that never ends, never resolves. A book that contains the concept of itself, containing the concept of itself, forever." The presence pressed closer, eager, hungry. My sketches showed me what would happen if the book was touched, how the recursive binding would collapse, how the things sealed here would pour out into a world that had forgotten how to defend against it. It would spread like a virus of unknowing, consuming meaning wherever it travelled. Cities would remain standing but empty of purpose. People would forget why buildings existed, what roads were for, why they themselves were walking upright instead of crawling. Language would fragment into meaningless sounds. Mathematics would become arbitrary symbols with no relationship to quantity or space. Within a year, human civilization would revert to something pre-linguistic. Within 5, we'd forget we'd ever been anything else. "We can't let anyone know this place exists," Captain Chen said. Her hand rested on her sidearm. I watched her calculate the math. 4 bullets, 4 team members. The forest would keep our secret. But Westbrook laughed, actually laughed, though it came out wrong. Too many syllables. "You think leaving helps? Leaving... You think we can unknow this? It's already in our heads. We're carriers now." He was right. I could feel it. The knowledge of how to break the seal wasn't something I'd learned. It was something that had been installed, a program waiting to execute. And programs don't care about the intentions of their host. Dr. Vance had started walking toward the platform. Not voluntarily. Her legs moved with mechanical precision, carrying her forward despite her obvious resistance. Tears still froze on her face, but her expression had gone slack, neutral. She was being piloted. "Vance, stop!" Captain Chen drew her weapon. "Shooting her won't help," I said, because I could see the pattern now, see how the presence had distributed itself among us. We were all infected, all potential release mechanisms. If Vance fell, another would rise. The thing had patience measured in geological time. It could wait for the right moment, the right weakness. My hand was moving toward my notebook again, toward the diagrams that showed exactly how to complete the ritual. I tried to stop, but my fingers had other priorities. Westbrook grabbed my wrist. His grip was ice cold. "Don't fight it. That makes it worse. You have to want something else more." "Want what?" But even as I asked, I understood. The presence fed on resistance, on the gap between intention and action. It lived in the space of internal contradiction. I forced myself to think about why I'd come to Silverthane in the first place. Not for the discovery or the academic glory. For the art. For the chance to document something beautiful and lost, to preserve meaning, not destroy it. The sketches in my notebook began changing again, not following the presence's instructions, but my own. I drew the dead trees, but this time capturing what they'd been before. The living forest, the elven city in its prime. Beauty that had existed and could exist again in representation, even if the original was gone. Each line was an act of remembering instead of forgetting, of imposing meaning instead of surrendering it. The presence recoiled. Not much, but enough. "That's it," Westbrook said. He'd started speaking English again, his voice raw. "It can't survive being defined, being known. That's why the elves bound it in a recursive story, something that constantly changes. Lock it down with concrete meaning and it starves." Dr. Vance had stopped walking. She swayed on her feet, her own will reasserting itself. Captain Chen lowered her weapon. "So we document it, make it knowable, turn it into data instead of nightmare." We spent the next 6 hours doing exactly that. Dr. Vance took measurements, reducing the presence to numbers and graphs. Captain Chen recorded tactical assessments, fitting it into military frameworks. Westbrook translated the Elvish script, giving concrete words to the binding ritual. And I drew. Page after page, capturing the clearing, the platform, the dead trees in precise detail, making them real, making them knowable, making them less than they wanted to be. The presence diminished with each observation, each measurement, each word that pinned it to specific meaning instead of allowing it to remain undefined. By the time we left Silverthane, it was just a thing. Strange and dangerous, but comprehensible. Contained not by ancient magic, but by modern understanding. The most effective cage humanity had ever developed. Scientific documentation. My sketches hang in a museum now, labelled Remnants of Silverthane Settlement. People walk past them every day, seeing only art, not understanding they're looking at a prison. That's fine, some meanings are better left forgotten. As long as someone remembers enough to maintain the bars, I still maintain the sketches. Every few months, I add new details from memory, reinforcing the documentation, making the presence more concrete, more knowable, more trapped in the amber of recorded observation. The Empire sealed the Whispering Vale shortly after our return. Official records list it as an ecological preservation zone. No entry permitted. The handful of elven refugees who escaped before Silverthane fell have never spoken about what they left behind. They don't need to. They carry the same burden we do now. The knowledge that some prisons require constant maintenance. Dr. Vance teaches at the university now, publishing papers on theoretical metaphysics that sound like academic exercises but are actually maintenance protocols. Captain Chen trains special reconnaissance units in techniques for documenting anomalous phenomena. Westbrook disappeared 6 months after our return. His last letter mentioned something about finding other places that needed witnessing, other meanings that required definition before they could devour themselves. And me? I draw. Constantly. Obsessively. Not just Silverthane anymore, but everything. Every street corner, every face, every moment worth preserving. Because I understand now what the elves learned too late. The world stays real only as long as someone is paying attention. Only as long as someone remembers to define it. The book on the platform is still there, still rewriting itself, still searching for the story that will set it free. But now it competes with our story, the one we documented, the one that says it's just an anomaly in a dead forest, nothing more. Some days I wonder if we really escaped Silverthane, or if we just became part of its containment structure. Another ring of trees, another layer of binding. Keeping watch over something that can never be allowed to forget that it's forgotten. The sketches help me sleep at night. Each line a reminder that meaning persists, that reality holds, that the world makes sense because we insist it does, one observation at a time.